All right, so now we are going to wrap up our adventure on stimulus control with a study that I did a few years ago as well, looking at applying generalization principles to enhance performance of homemade explosive detection. So, as a little bit of background into odors specifically that we haven't gotten into yet, is that when it comes to odor mixtures, all bets are off. So when you have odors that start mixing together different chemicals, complex things start to occur, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to make a variety of different predictions. So when we were talking about the single stimulus for our generalization gradients, that was referring to a single chemical or a single property. In fact, it wasn't even referring to chemicals most of the time. We were talking about wavelengths of light. But that seems to also only really work with very specific individual chemicals, singular chemicals, the concentration of a single chemical in this situation. Some of the phenomena apply across different kinds of mixtures of chemicals, but for the most part, we've been talking about relatively simplistic situations. But then when it comes to complex chemical mixtures, like our fuel oxidizer mixtures for different kinds of explosives, or even just explosives in general, all of them are made of a variety of different chemicals. And the same goes true for our narcotics. Our human remains is even more volatiles associated with those mixtures. But nonetheless, a lot of the things that we're training our dogs to find are not just single molecules, they're actually complex mixtures. And we cannot really reduce these complex mixtures ever to single molecules, except for a handful of occasions. Again, everything is always going to be, well, it's a handful of occasions, just because odors themselves are quite complicated, and it's very hard to make any broad generalizations across them. Nonetheless, when it comes to complex sort of odor mixtures, we know that humans are really quite poor at identifying individual components in mixtures. Once we mix 5 different chemicals together, it becomes very hard for humans to be able to identify those individual components. When it comes to odor processing of complex mixtures, particularly when we have very complex mixtures together, we have different ways of sort of processing those kinds of mixtures. One is called configural and another is called elemental. And we'll break these down in just a second. But configural, simplistically to get across, is when the combination of a variety of odors come together to produce a unique other odor that isn't just smelling each of those individual components. So you've probably heard of the theory that when you smell like a pot roast, the dog smells each of those individual components, but us humans can only perceive the complex mixture of just pot roast as a smell. That's sort of tying into a configural versus elemental perception. A configural perception would be I can only smell pot roast. An elemental perspective is that I just smell all of the individual components, and I don't even smell pot roast. I just smell each of those individual components all mixed together. So, but we do know that whether you get elemental or configural perception, one is strongly dependent on the chemicals and the ratio of those chemicals, as well as the complexity of those chemicals, as well as your experience with those chemicals as well. So you can have a switch from perceptual to elemental based off of learning history and experience with those kinds of chemicals. Let's try and explain a little bit about that odor processing in more detail. So elemental would be like, say, for example, I took this red color, this green color, and then I swirl them together and it produces this kind of red-green swirl where I can still detect the individual components of the red and the green. And when I look at it, I see red and green. Whereas in the configural scenario, I mix the red and green and it produces yellow. When I look at this yellow splash, I don't see red and green, I just see yellow. This is A plus B equals C, where A plus B equals AB in this situation. So this is the elemental, you see those individual elements. This is the configural, where it sort of combines to produce this third element. And we do know that for a variety of species, we can have certain configural processing in different scenarios. So for example, there's one particular chemical mixture that has one chemical that smells strawberry-like, another chemical that smells a bit caramel-like. You mix them in a very precise ratio together, and it actually produces a pineapple perception, which clearly is not from any of those individual components. When you smell pineapple, you don't smell strawberry and caramel mixed together. It's not necessarily what you would predict at all. And this is an example of configural processing. We also know that dogs that are trained on one form of ammonium nitrate do not readily generalize to other forms of ammonium nitrate, and dogs trained on pure chlorates don't seem to generalize very well to chlorate mixtures or fuel oxidizer mixtures of those chlorates unless they're explicitly trained to some of those mixtures. So when it comes to dogs that are required to detect homemade explosives, this becomes quite challenging, especially when it comes to fuel oxidizer mixtures, because in these situations, you have a fuel source that's mixed with an oxidizer, and the fuel source can be highly variable and can be made of a variety of different kinds of fuels. And we were interested in, well, how can we potentially train dogs to be able to do this? And one potential training method might be we train the dogs to a very pure form of the target itself. So for something like an ammonium nitrate mixture, perhaps we can train the dogs specifically to the ammonium nitrate. And if we get the dogs to detect that very nice ammonium nitrate, then perhaps through elemental processing of complex mixtures, the dogs would be able to recognize this ammonium nitrate in all of those mixtures and respond. So preliminary evidence against this procedure with the chlorates, because Dr. Lazarowski and Dr. Dorman demonstrated that this did not work very well for chlorates. And then a second approach would be to actually train dogs using a wide range of mixtures. And this would be something like using that concept formation training that we talked about earlier. Remember with the pigeons, with the complex training for the Picasso versus the Monet paintings, that they were able to learn a very complex discrimination between one category of stimuli versus another category of stimuli. And this was done by giving them many examples of one category of stimuli and many examples of the other category, and letting the animal differentiate between what makes something this category and what makes something that category. And with odors, this was recently been done by Rogny et al. That found that you can, if you give rodents a wide range of target odor mixtures and a wide range of non-target odor mixtures, that they can actually learn to separate and be able to successfully categorize a wide range of target odors from non-target odors, similar to the pigeons being able to then be able to demonstrate with novel pictures whether something was more Picasso-like or Monet-like. Our question was, could we use a similar training approach to ask dogs if they could separate something that's more ammonium nitrate-like versus not ammonium nitrate-like? So bringing this into the homemade explosives, we know that something like ammonium nitrate as an oxidizer could be mixed with different fuels and be a potentially dangerous situation. But if you take out just the one ingredient of ammonium nitrate, you have a potentially delicious situation. So our question is, well, in this case, how do we train optimally to get to what we want, where they would find this kind of ammonium nitrate with different fuel oil targets? Is it that we train specifically to the ammonium nitrate so that the dogs have a very clear picture that the ammonium nitrate is what I want you to find, and then let them figure out what ammonium nitrate smells in those different kinds of mixtures? Or did we need to train them to a more specific situation in which they received ammonium nitrate mixtures with ammonium nitrate versus mixtures without ammonium nitrate? So step one of elemental training the elemental procedure, or the target only procedure, would be train them directly to the ammonium nitrate versus a variety of different distractors. We compare this to our mixture training method, in which we train the dogs to a mixture that includes ammonium nitrate, where the distractors would be the same distractors mixed together, but without ammonium nitrate. So pure ammonium nitrate versus distractors, or ammonium nitrate and mixtures versus distractors. What we did is that we rotated through a variety of these different kinds of distractors. So the only thing that remained constant was the ammonium nitrate with these kinds of distractors, and looked at, well, how do they then detect different ammonium nitrate mixtures? So we had a relatively small sample size, but we have 4 dogs. We did it with ammonium nitrate as the oxidizer and hydrogen peroxide as an oxidizer. 2 dogs were trained using that sort of mixture training method. 2 dogs were trained using that elemental method. And then those dogs switched over. So the dogs that initially had the target only went to the mixture. The dogs that had the mixture went over to the elemental. And then we mixed the odors for two different kinds of test trials. We had mixture test trials where the mixture was made up of components that the distractor components the dog was already familiar with. And then we had probes that included unfamiliar distractors. So these would be trials where the ammonium nitrate was mixed with completely novel distractors that the dogs didn't receive in training. And the question is which group, dogs that were trained with just ammonium nitrate versus distractors versus dogs that were trained with ammonium nitrate mixtures versus other mixture distractors, performed better. And this is what we found. We found that overall, in our mixture group versus our target only group, we had relatively similar proportion corrects when in the training scenarios. Then when it came to the probe trials, our mixture dogs tended to perform slightly better than our target only dogs. And that when it came to the components that they were familiar with, our mixture dogs performed better than our target only dogs. In terms of false alarm rate, it was basically the same across the board. It didn't change too much, at least in a no significant manner. But what was most interesting was the differentiation in the mixture group for the hit rate. So this was if we presented a mixture that contained ammonium nitrate inside of it, inside of that mixture, did you respond? And the mixture dogs, whether it was something in the regular training material, whether it was a probe that had completely novel ingredients mixed in, or whether it was a trial that had familiar ingredients mixed in, the mixture dogs all responded the same. They had no problem with any variation of what those distractor components were. When it came to the dogs that were trained to the target only, they were able to find the target just fine. But then when it was mixed in with novel ingredients, they had about a 27 to 28% alert rate. They had a substantial drop in their overall alert rate, such that this was probably the most significant finding, is that when the target was present in a novel mixture, the dogs that were only trained to the target had a substantial decline in detection or alerting to that particular mixture, though if dogs were familiar with a variety of mixtures of that target, had absolutely no decrement in being able to detect that in terms of the hit rate. But because our actual testing sessions were also training, we were able to look at, well, how quickly do the dogs learn it? And we found that within 5 or 6 days of testing, by being tested with different mixtures that included the ammonium nitrate, they very quickly learn to start responding to novel mixtures of ammonium nitrate. So that learning was actually really, really fast, but it did indicate that the dogs had to have the experience of what that ammonium nitrate smelled like in those mixtures. So to me, the way that I kind of interpreted this in terms of that kind of configural elemental processing versus our generalization gradients is that it seems that when it comes to these complex, is my target present in this mixture, that there needs to be a training component that explicitly tackles that component. Is this my target in this mixture versus not in this mixture? It helps in that all of these dogs were previously trained to the target itself. So they knew sort of what the target was, but they needed that extra training to indicate what that target then smelled like in different kinds of mixtures, and that my target can appear in different kinds of mixtures, and that I should still respond to that. So when it comes to elemental versus configural processing, you can also think of it a little bit as a potential modification on that idea of, say, the pot roast with all of those different individual components. So that maybe perhaps, you know, when you are first given a pot roast, it smells like a pot roast of all of these complex components. But if you are a trained chef, right, and you have lots of experience tasting pot roast with these herbs added versus these herbs added, and being able to differentiate between them, you can learn, and we know that chefs can do this, that you can learn to be able to identify what individual ingredients are occurring within some of these mixtures, so that perhaps that it's not just about an absolute perception, but a little bit also about your learning history and training. And that if you learn what a pot roast tastes with this ingredient versus a pot roast tastes with that ingredient, then you can start making those elemental separations, but you have to have that sort of robust training of what that target smells like with mixtures versus that target without mixtures to build those capabilities. And it didn't happen spontaneously by just long-term training of the pure oxidizer in this case. And that wraps up stimulus control.